There are two diametrically opposed ways of studying the history of human thought, and unfortunately, people often pick the wrong one instinctively when they turn to the study of history. So we have to root out this misconception if we are going to get anywhere in historical study. And here I have characterized first the erroneous way of studying history, as indicate with this big red X, And this perspective is a perspective based on assuming that you have the right answer. You know, so you look at history and you say, when did people start thinking like me? You take yourself as a reference, kind of gold standard, and you evaluate the way people were thinking in the past, using this, using yourself as the answer key, as it were. And so the question of history, if you look at history this way, what history comes down to is kind of a list of, who was clever enough to come up with the right answer. In what year did somebody come up with the right answer, and who deserves credit for such and such a thing. Those are the kinds of style of writing that one ends up with when writing history in this kind of spirit. And unfortunately, it's very common and also very foolish, because it is a way of looking at history that precludes the possibility of learning anything really of any importance, because you have already fixed your thought in advance, which means that you're not going to broaden your horizons and learn anything new, or being able to embrace alternative perspectives. So these kinds of things are precluded by this mad assumption of saying that you already have all the answers. If you already think that you have all the right answers, then you might as well not study history in the first place. But unfortunately, people do approach it with this kind of spirit. Well, what then is the opposite approach? It's like this: you embrace the diversity of thought. You say people did it differently in the past. That's very interesting. They must have had a reason for doing it differently. They must have. What were they thinking? How can we understand their point of view? How can we see the reasoning that led them to these discoveries? So that is going to be a point of view that you can embrace, which is going to be a lot more enriching. It's going to add to your own understanding of the subject matter, and it's going to broaden your understanding of diverse viewpoints and be enriching in these ways. So that's obviously a much better way of approaching history in any case, and it's based on understanding past works in their own right. So you study past works in terms of what did this person really want to say, and what was his reasoning, rather than studying the past works in the sense that of just evaluating it in the light of a later answer key, so to speak. So I advocate the second approach, and here now I have for illustration, you can illustrate these points more concretely with in the situation involving, let's say, the transition from astrology to modern science. You can think of scientific revolution, Newton, Galileo, all this stuff. The modern scientific point of view, which superseded astrological beliefs, which have been held for thousands of years before that time. So, therefore, I placed them on in the time scale in the schematic way, and here's the first way of studying history, the one that I argued against. It's basically assumes that people did stuff the wrong way because they were a little bit stupid, and finally somebody came along, a great enough genius, like Newton was so smart that he figured out the right way of doing things, and the history is organized in this kind of progression towards the right answer, as it were, from stupidity to smartness. And it's just a question of who who was genius enough at what point in time so that we progressed further towards the right answer. So this is the approach that I wanted to reject. This is the approach that is going to preclude any interesting perspectives being reached. By contrast, the alternative approach is the one that says the things that came earlier in point in time, they didn't come earlier, then they're not different from ours because people then were stupid and couldn't figure out the right way. Rather, we assume in this alternative approach that people did something else first, like astrology, for example, before Newtonian science, because it makes more sense, it's more natural, and it is what a rational person would do in that situation, given the circumstances, given the situation that people found themselves in here thousands of years before Newton. Astrology was the right thing to do. It just made more sense. Any rational person should believe astrology, finding themselves in that situation, rather than the modern scientific theories. So that is the basic assumption of history that goes with the second approach, the empathetic appreciation approach that tries to understand people in their own terms. So this is the kind of contrast then that I use the contrast between astrology and science to bring this out, to put these things at its most critical point of conflict, so to speak. Everybody knows astrology is wrong and so on, and everybody knows that science, that Newton got it right. Obviously, Newton is the greatest hero of all time. So that's why I use this contrast to introduce the study of the history of science, because it brings out this dichotomy between these two approaches in its really in its clearest form. It really the focal point of this conflict. So I have already argued in a previous video that modern science is very unnatural indeed. The Newtonian theory of gravity is absurd and occult, like Newton himself said. So you understand why I was so eager to stress that in my introductory video, because that's it goes with this broader point of view where I consider that the fact that these discoveries took so many thousands of years, it's not because we had to wait for a great genius like Newton to finally figure it out, but rather that it took so long because it's absurd and occult, and Newton himself says so. By contrast, astrology was extremely natural. It's a lot less absurd and occult than Newtonian physics, and that's why it came thousands of years before. It makes thousands of years worth of more sense. And this is what I am going to argue in the coming videos. I'm going to use the case of astrology as a paradigm example of this this principle of studying history, that put aside your current beliefs, put aside what you think you know, that astrology is of course wrong and so on, and look at it with an open mind. And you will find that astrology made tons of sense. And if you're going to ever learn anything from history, understand anything about past thought, this is the only way you will ever do it, by embracing alternative viewpoints and understanding them in an open-minded fashion. So that's how I will proceed to the study of astrology in these terms.